In the annals of history, there are moments when the weight of victory proves to be far greater than the burden of defeat. It is the paradox of triumph. The very thing that seems to elevate its victors to the pinnacle of glory can also be the force that topples them from that height. This is the story of a victory so complete that it didn't just reshape the world. It destroyed the very people who claimed it. The victors, who stood tall in their moment of conquest, would soon find themselves at the mercy of their own success. And in the end, they would realize that their greatest achievement was their undoing. It begins like many other stories, when the drums of war fade into silence and the last echoes of battle give way to a newfound peace. The victors are celebrated, their banners raised high, their names etched into the annals of history. For a time, they bask in the glory of their triumph. But what follows is not the endless celebrations they expected. Instead, what emerges from the shadows of victory is a far more insidious enemy, one that no sword can slay and no shield can protect against. At the heart of this paradox lies the concept of unintended consequences. A victory is often seen as the final achievement, the point at which everything culminates. But as any great general or ruler can attest, victory is not an end. It is the beginning of something far more complex. It brings with it a set of challenges that the victors are ill-prepared for. This is the true price of success, and it is one that history has often failed to recognize. When an army wins, it does not merely defeat its enemies. It inherits the power and responsibility of ruling the vanquished lands. The victor must govern, rebuild, and maintain control over what they have won. And this is where the rot begins. The victors, who once fought side by side with their comrades, are now faced with the task of managing a fragile empire. They must deal with the alliances they forged under duress, the rebellions that inevitably arise, and the political intrigues of those who see the victory as an opportunity to seize power for themselves. Consider the fate of the ancient Romans, whose victories in battle often led to the collapse of the very ideals they had fought to protect. The conquest of new lands brought riches, but it also brought instability. As the empire expanded, it became harder to govern, harder to maintain control. What was once a republic of citizens became an empire ruled by the whims of emperors. The soldiers who fought so valiantly for Rome's glory were now faced with the grim task of managing territories far beyond their capacity. Victory had brought them nothing but more responsibility, and with it, more enemies. The emotional toll of this newfound power was no less devastating. The victors, who had once been brothers in arms, were now divided by the spoils of war. Allies became rivals, and comrades turned into adversaries. The very people who had fought together, side by side, were now locked in a battle for control of the future. The tension between the generals, the political elites, and the common soldiers grew palpable. The once unified force now fractured into factions, each vying for influence in a new, unstable world. In the immediate aftermath of victory, the victors are often swept up in the euphoria of their achievement. The sense of invincibility is overwhelming, the belief that no force in the world could ever rival their strength. But as time goes on, cracks begin to appear in this illusion. The victors find themselves unable to cope with the weight of their newfound status, and the very systems they put in place to govern their empire begin to crumble. The responsibilities of leadership prove too great, the demands of the people too numerous, and the pressure of maintaining power too overwhelming. For many victors, the moment of conquest is the beginning of their downfall. It is a victory that brings no joy, no peace. The generals who once commanded legions with supreme authority now find themselves struggling to hold onto that power. The kings and emperors who ascended to their thrones with the blood of their enemies on their hands are now faced with the challenge of ruling over vast, diverse populations that see them not as liberators, but as conquerors. They may have won the battle, but they lost the war within themselves. This is not just a tale of military leaders, it is a story that transcends time and place. It is the story of any society that has risen to power through force. Whether it is the rise and fall of empires, the aftermath of civil wars, or the consequences of a single military victory, the result is often the same. The victors are left to contend with the very thing they sought to overcome. They are forced to reckon with the psychological toll of their actions, the moral compromises they made, and the lives they destroyed in their quest for dominance. History is filled with examples of victors who were destroyed by their own success. Consider the fate of Alexander the Great, whose sweeping conquests created an empire that stretched from Greece to India. While he was hailed as one of the greatest military minds in history, the empire he built was short-lived. After his death, it fragmented into warring factions, and the world he had shaped began to unravel. His victory, once seen as the pinnacle of human achievement, proved to be unsustainable, and the empire he left behind collapsed under its own weight. Similarly, the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte serves as another powerful example of victory's destructive force. Napoleon's military genius brought him countless victories and transformed France into one of the most powerful nations in Europe. But as his empire expanded, so too did his overreach. The same ambition that drove him to victory led to his eventual downfall, as the demands of empire building proved too great. His defeat in Russia, followed by his exile, marked the end of a reign that had once seemed unstoppable. Napoleon, like so many before him, discovered that victory is often a prelude to ruin. This paradox is not limited to the battlefield. It extends to the political, social, and even personal realms. When a society or an individual achieves success through force or conquest, they are left to grapple with the consequences of that victory. They are faced with the task of managing not just the territories they have won, but the people they have subjugated, the resources they have plundered, and the ethical compromises they have made along the way. Victory, it seems, is not always the end. It is merely the beginning of a far more complex and dangerous journey. In the end, the true cost of victory is not measured in the spoils of war, but in the toll it takes on the victors themselves. The very things they fought for, the power, the glory, the empire, are often the very things that destroy them. And as history continues to unfold, we are reminded of the lesson that those who triumph in battle are not always the ones who live to tell the tale. The victors, it seems, are often the ones who pay the highest price. As the dust settled from the victorious clash, the celebratory cries of triumph echoed across the battlefield. At first, the victors were buoyed by their overwhelming success, their hearts filled with a sense of invincibility. The world seemed to be theirs for the taking. Yet, in the days that followed, the aftertaste of their victory became increasingly bitter. The triumph that had seemed so sweet began to turn sour as they realized the true cost of their success. What they had won was not simply a land or a throne, but a heavy mantle of responsibility that no one had prepared them for. In the immediate aftermath of victory, everything seemed perfect, at least on the surface. The enemy had been decisively crushed, and the victors stood tall, their banners flying high, their armies parading through the streets in a spectacular show of power. It was the culmination of years of struggle, sacrifice, and ambition. But as the victorious leaders sat in their war rooms, surrounded by advisors, generals, and courtiers, the first cracks began to appear. The grand plans that had brought them to this moment started to unravel, as they faced the monumental task of not just ruling, but managing the empire they had so ruthlessly conquered. What became apparent in the early days after victory was that the land they had claimed was far more complex than they had ever imagined. The territories were not homogeneous. They were filled with diverse peoples, different cultures, religions, and systems of governance. These populations, who had once been subjects of their enemies, now looked upon the victors with distrust and fear. What was supposed to be a unifying moment, an unquestionable victory for the conquerors, began to reveal itself as a delicate balancing act, fraught with internal tensions. The victors, who had once shared a common purpose on the battlefield, now found themselves divided by competing interests. The generals who had fought side by side were no longer allies. They were rivals, each seeking to expand their influence and control over the new territories. The political elites who had supported the war effort, motivated by personal gain, began to clash over the distribution of power and wealth. The victors, once united by the cause of war, now faced an internal battle that threatened to tear them apart. At the heart of this fracturing unity lay the realization that victory had come at a steep price. The victors had achieved their goal, but they had lost something far more valuable in the process: their cohesion, their shared vision. What had once been a tightly knit coalition of soldiers, generals, and politicians was now an unstable patchwork of factions, each pulling in a different direction. The leaders who had once made decisions with the clarity of a common enemy now found themselves indecisive, unsure of how to navigate the labyrinth of political intrigue, betrayal, and personal ambition that was beginning to consume them. In this new world where alliances were temporary and loyalty was easily bought, the victors found themselves grappling with the very forces they had once sought to control. The soldiers who had followed them into battle, once loyal to a fault, were now questioning their leader's authority. The spoils of war, once seen as the reward for their struggles, were quickly becoming a source of contention. Each general wanted a larger share of the empire, each politician wanted more power, and each noble wanted more land. The unity that had been forged on the battlefield was now being replaced by selfishness, greed, and distrust. The complexities of ruling were far greater than any of the victors had anticipated. The lands they had conquered were vast, and the logistics of managing such an empire were overwhelming. The military, once the source of their strength, became a burden as they struggled to maintain control over their new territories. What had once been a singular, cohesive force now had to be divided and spread thin, managing multiple fronts of conflict, both external and internal. Moreover, the conquered peoples were not merely passive subjects waiting for their new rulers to impose order. Resistance began to rise, not just from rival factions within the conquered lands, but from the very heart of the victor's own ranks. The victor's peace, it seemed, was not a peace at all. Rebellions broke out, fueled by resentment and the desire to reclaim lost autonomy. The more the victors tried to impose their will, the more opposition they encountered. What had seemed like a straightforward war of conquest had transformed into a protracted struggle for stability, one that no amount of military might could easily suppress. And yet, the victors were not prepared for the mental and emotional toll that came with this reality. Victory, which had seemed like the final achievement, was now the beginning of a slow unraveling. The leaders, once filled with the zeal of conquest, found themselves weary, unsure, and filled with doubt. The burden of responsibility, the constant need to manage a crumbling empire, took its toll on their minds and spirits. What had once been clear, victory at any cost, now felt hollow. The spoils of war had not brought satisfaction, they had only brought more questions, more struggles, and more fears. The victors, who had once held their heads high in the glory of battle, now found themselves haunted by the very people they had defeated. The conquered lands were filled with resentment, distrust, and the painful memory of what had been lost. The rebellion simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over at any moment. As the victors tried to impose order, they only found themselves fighting battles they had never anticipated. The original dream of conquest, the vision of power and glory, seemed more distant with each passing day. The psychological weight of this shift cannot be overstated. The victors, once seen as invincible, now found themselves in a constant state of anxiety, wondering whether their success would prove to be their undoing. The very act of ruling, of managing an empire that was not only vast but also filled with internal strife, became a constant source of tension. The victors, once confident in their military prowess, now found themselves at the mercy of their own decisions. They had fought for power, but they now faced the possibility that the power they had won might be their undoing. At the same time, the victors' political opponents saw an opportunity. The internal fractures within the ranks of the victors were becoming increasingly evident, and their enemies, those who had once been the defeated, began to turn the tide. What had seemed like a moment of absolute victory was now a precarious balancing act. The victors, unable to trust one another, began to lose the very things they had fought so hard to achieve. The political and military victories they had secured were slipping from their grasp, their once impenetrable unity becoming little more than a shadow of its former self. This is the hidden cost of victory. The moment when the conquering forces realize that their success has set in motion a series of events they are no longer in control of. The victory that had promised so much had now become their greatest enemy. The toll it had taken on their unity, their mental stability, and their ability to govern was beginning to show. The internal struggles, the political divisions, and the rising rebellions were merely the first signs of a much deeper crisis that would soon engulf them entirely. What had once been a great triumph was now a slow burn toward inevitable collapse. And the victors, once sure of their place in history, were now forced to question whether they would survive the very victory they had fought so hard to achieve. As the victors struggled to maintain their grasp on the territories they had won, the initial euphoria of conquest quickly faded, replaced by the harsh reality of governing a fractured empire. The burden of ruling was far greater than any of them had anticipated. The strategic brilliance that had won them the battle now seemed insufficient to handle the myriad problems that arose in the aftermath. Every decision, every action seemed to have unintended consequences, as if the very victory that had placed them in power was now working against them. The most immediate challenge that arose was the management of the lands they had conquered. What was once a unified enemy force had now fragmented into numerous independent regions, each with its own local customs, political structures, and grievances. The victors, in their zeal to claim territory, had not fully considered the complexities of the people they had conquered. The citizens of these lands were not merely passive subjects, they were individuals with their own identities, histories, and loyalties. The victors had inherited not just land, but a tangled web of social, economic, and political realities that were far beyond their comprehension. This fragmentation of power created a deeply unstable environment. The victors, who had relied on their military strength to win, now found themselves without the military advantage they once held. The armies that had swept across the battlefield with such speed and precision were now stretched thin, struggling to maintain order over vast distances. The logistical difficulties of managing such a sprawling empire became immediately apparent. Supplies were delayed, communication was slow, and the coordination between different factions of the victors' forces was fractured. The empire, once unified under the banner of conquest, was now a collection of competing interests, each pulling in a different direction. To compound the problem, the generals and military leaders who had once been allies now found themselves at odds with one another. The internal divisions began to manifest in a very real and dangerous way. Some generals, emboldened by their success, sought to carve out their own spheres of influence, using their military power to secure control over key territories. Others, who felt slighted by their lack of recognition or reward, began to sow dissent, questioning the leadership of their comrades. What had once been a well-oiled machine of military coordination had now become a fractured and dysfunctional entity, each leader more concerned with their own ambitions than the success of the whole. These divisions were not just political, they were personal. The leaders who had once shared a common bond in the crucible of war now found themselves engaged in bitter rivalries. Trust, which had been essential during the battle, had been eroded by the realities of power. The same generals who had fought side by side were now accusing each other of betrayal, dishonesty, and ambition. The victors, who had once been united in their struggle against a common enemy, were now fighting a different battle altogether, one for control, for dominance, and for their own survival. This breakdown of unity was mirrored by the growing unrest among the conquered populations. The victors had not just defeated an enemy, they had upended the very social order that had existed for centuries. The people of the conquered lands, who had once followed their own rulers and traditions, now found themselves under foreign domination. For many, this was a bitter pill to swallow. What the victors had seen as a necessary conquest, the people of these lands saw as an invasion. The initial sense of relief from the oppression of their former rulers soon gave way to resentment, anger, and fear. The victors, however, were not equipped to handle this resistance. Their military might, which had proven so effective on the battlefield, was now inadequate in dealing with the social and political dynamics of the occupied territories. Rebellions began to erupt in various corners of the empire. These were not just random uprisings, but carefully planned and organized revolts led by charismatic local leaders who understood the terrain and the people far better than the invaders did. The victors, who had once seemed unstoppable, now found themselves fighting a war of attrition against an enemy that knew how to exploit their weaknesses. The rebellions were not confined to the periphery of the empire, they began to spread, fueled by a combination of local grievances and the victors' overextension. What had started as isolated pockets of resistance soon coalesced into a broader movement. The forces that the victors had once used to crush their enemies now found themselves on the defensive, struggling to maintain control over territories they had once easily subdued. The military advantage, which had been so decisive during the battle, was now a distant memory. The victors were now engaged in a battle not just for survival, but for the very legitimacy of their rule. As the rebellions grew in intensity, so too did the internal strife within the ranks of the victors. The leaders who had once been celebrated as heroes were now facing the consequences of their decisions. The demands of ruling an empire had stretched them thin, and the cracks in their leadership were beginning to show. The generals, once seen as pillars of strength, now bickered over strategy, over the allocation of resources, and over the future direction of the empire. Some sought to quell the uprisings with brute force, while others advocated for diplomacy and compromise. But no solution seemed to work, and each decision seemed to worsen the situation.